Thank you all for joining us this morning for our DSA virtual access panel discussion on addressing the chronic homelessness downtown. We are very excited about our guests this morning. A few quick items from me. We will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat this morning, so please feel free to leave your comments or questions in there for Felix, our moderator, and he will pull some of the comments and questions out of the chat and the Q&A during our discussion this morning. I will be recording this, so we will share it out on our YouTube channel afterwards. I think that's it for me this morning, so I will go ahead and turn things over to our moderator, Felix.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to DSA for organizing these discussions, and thanks for panelists for joining us. I want to introduce everybody, then we'll get to the conversation. First of all, we have Marc Dones, who's the CEO of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. Marc became the inaugural executive director of the KCRHA in April of last year. Previously, Marc was a founder and executive director of the National Innovation Service, a consulting firm that helps governments redesign their approaches to supporting marginalized populations. Marc holds a degree from New York University and is an experienced equity trainer. Our second panelist is Felicia Salcedo. She's executive director of We Are In. She joined that organization last November. It's a collaboration of organizations and individuals working together to end homelessness in King County with funding from local philanthropies and foundations. Previously, she held various roles with King County, including with the Department of Health. Felicia is a graduate of Gonzaga University and Leadership Tomorrow. Excuse me. Tiffany Washington is Deputy Mayor of the City of Seattle. Deputy Mayor Washington is responsible for implementing Mayor Harrell's agenda for homelessness and housing insecurity. She previously served as Division Director of Homelessness within the city's Human Services Department and was Deputy Director of the city's Department of Education and Early Learning. Mayor Washington holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Washington and a Master of Science from Capella University. All right. I always like to start things off with some basic data points. And I have to open that document up. Give me 1 second here. I thought I had the data points in front of me and they've disappeared. Here we go here. All right. All right. As Emily mentioned, we do have some questions that we've prepared in advance, and we want you to participate via the chat function. Post anything there and we'll fold that into the conversation. All right, so here's a few data points. Around 20,000 households access King County's homeless response system annually. In the most recent point-in-time count by the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, there are 13,368 people experiencing homelessness in King County. That's a 12% increase since 2020. And overall, the KCRHA estimates that there's 40,000 people experiencing homelessness over the course of a year in King County. DSA and KCRHA estimate that there's around 800 chronically homeless people living in downtown Seattle. And the Partnership for Zero, a coalition of city county agencies, businesses, philanthropies, and service providers, was launched in February of this year with a $10 million investment. All right. Now, in talking about this issue in our preparations the last couple of days, and we got together with the panelists earlier in the week as well, it's a very complex issue. There's a very complex ecosystem or ecology of organizations. Thought it might be really helpful to start out with kind of setting the stage and describing, giving kind of a mapping out the geography of the different organizations represented today and how it all fits together in terms of addressing the issue of homelessness. Marc, is that something you want to take a crack at, kind of laying out the ecology of how these organizations fit together and the role that you've taken on with the KCRHA?
Sure, I can give it a go. And knowing these two other folks well, I know that they'll correct me if I'm wrong. Again, Marc Dones, they, them pronouns. So the authority has taken over the role of centralizing essentially all of the services, right? So anything that is a service that is part of what we call our crisis response is now either contracted with or administered by the authority. So that's everything from outreach all the way through the services, again, just the services attached to permanent supportive housing. We don't do the development, we don't site, but we fund the services that are in those buildings. when people talk about the complexity of the ecosystem, though, they are often not talking about just our government partners. They are talking about all of our nonprofit providers that are funded through the authority now, and oftentimes also thinking about our philanthropic partners. And so while the authority has all of the essentially all the public money that flows into the homelessness response system coming from King County and the city of Seattle, Felicia heads an organization called We Are In that is essentially the same center of gravity for our philanthropic partners, and really looking to create alignment, a long-term structural alignment that drives everything in the same direction. And one of the things that a number of folks have noted over the course of the last 10 years in report writing for our community is that our philanthropic community often funded a diverse array of projects that weren't always super aligned with what our system was trying to do. And so Felicia's job, bless her, is to make sure that that doesn't happen anymore. And then Deputy Mayor Washington, and it's funny because I talk to both these people like 9 times a day, so this is also just fun for me. But Deputy Mayor Washington is leading the things that don't sit at the authority, right? So really driving how the city responds to city-based issues. And much of that, to be clear, is around things like land use and, rights of way, things that like I as a appointed county person have nothing to do with. Like those are not my purview. I don't want them to be my purview. And so that is what Tiffany gets to do every day, and we're very grateful for the fact that I don't have to do it. Additionally, Deputy Mayor Washington also has a lot of the actual housing generation stuff, right? So like, how are we going to make new housing? Where will it be sited? That kind of stuff that is, driven through the Office of Housing at the city, which reports into Deputy Mayor Washington. So that is our rough ecosystem. It is, as with most things in government, it feels really opaque. And can feel overly complex. And I think that one of the things that the three of us are trying to do is one, make that just less true, right? By operating our respective centers of gravity and being in steady communication, making it so that like we're essentially able to say, and I think Deputy Mayor Washington and I do this quite well actually on the daily, like just being like, oh, that's the authority, oh, that's the city. But it's just between the two of us. It's not like you're gonna then get ping ponged between 16 other, it's just like, is this Mark? Is this Tiffany? Similarly, I think the three of us are also really committed to talking really plainly about like, what's up? Like, what is happening? And trying to demystify what is happening, right? And make sure that the work is accessible to the public, given how I think opaque and unclear it has been over the last 10 years.
Yeah, and I want to get to the communications issues and sort of how the three of you and how the KCRHA, I have to say it in correct order, how you interface with the public in sharing complex messages. We'll get down to that a little bit farther down the line. I want to give Felicia a chance to talk about We Are In and how, hear her perspective about how that fits into what we're talking about this morning and kind of the origins of that and what the goals of and how that, if for someone who has no idea and hasn't heard of that organization before, what is We Are In?
Yeah, happy to share a little bit more. So everything Mark said is true. We were created in a parallel process, actually, as the King County Regional Homeless Authority was being stood up. So the private funders, business, and philanthropy came together with an understanding that they wanted to support the public partners. So making sure that the KCRHA could come online so that there was a more coordinated public response to our homelessness crisis. But they also recognized that they wanted to do a better job of coordinating their private dollars for more impactful investments in the crisis response system and beyond as well. So our focus is on homelessness. We really want to end homelessness across King County, but we also are thinking about big picture upstream solutions to that. So we are helping the KCRHA with the crisis response system and are very supportive of that. We're also looking at prevention opportunities and affordable housing long-term, because we know we need to create more meaningful places for folks who are in the crisis response system to go, whether that be ahead of their crisis of homelessness or as they're exiting our system. So we're focused on that as well. We do make direct grants to partners in the community. So some of our grants may be to KCRHA, some of them may be directly to service providers across the community as well. And then we're also heavily focused on communications and advocacy. So recognizing that the general public really needs to know what's going on around this issue. Where are there solutions that are working well? And then how do we invest more in those solutions? And because we have private dollars, we can be more flexible with the investments that we make as well. So we are not intended to supplant public funds that are going to be addressing this issue, but we really want to be able to pilot new and innovative strategies that may see progress on this issue, and then take those to our partners for scaling. So that's really the idea behind We Are In. It's everyone external to what Marc and Tiffany are doing at the city and the county and KCRHA. So it's the funders, but it's also the broader community of folks who have lived experience of homelessness, of advocates, of service providers, of just general members of the community who really have an interest in this and want to be involved in those solutions.
So Deputy Mayor Washington, I think, well, you've been deputy mayor for, what is it, about 5 months, right? What's the biggest change that you can point to from having We Are In existing and KCRHA existing, and what the city's trying to accomplish around homelessness?
Good morning. I would say the biggest difference of having KCRHA has to do with, I can give an example of the recent data that I just looked at, which the organization was able to take all of the contracts from across the county that focus on homelessness issues and try to and unearth some inconsistencies that have been in place for decades. And the reason there's been an inconsistencies for decades is because the city has had their contracts, the county has had their contracts, and all of us were paying providers differently. All of us were asking for different outcomes. And there was no one person in charge of, or organization in charge of ensuring that the services for individuals living unsheltered were synchronized, aligned, equitable, distributed equally across the county. And so we never really could get a snapshot of like how many people are living unsheltered, which the point in time count, while I call it bad data, which means best available data. It's all we had. Now we have an entity in KCRHA that holds all the data and can get us more accurate numbers around this, what problem, how big is this problem? Also, what was unearthed, and I hope, Marc, I'm not revealing something, and if I am, tell me stop mid-sentence, is that there's a wide variety in cost per bed across the continuum. So some people, some organizations are being paid $117 plus, and I'm making up numbers, and other organizations are being paid $30 per bed, and that is inequitable. And then the saturation of services for organizations differ widely. And so I'm so excited that there's one organization that can make sure that from the time someone receives an eviction notice all the way through to the time someone enters into permanent housing, that the services are tailored towards the individual needs of people, but that also everybody's rowing in the right direction. And it sounds simple for most people. I don't know why it took so long for us to get here, but when you think about it, it's very simplistic, which is there should be one person on first that is making sure that all of these things align and that everybody is moving towards a North Star. I would say for We Are In, another issue, as someone who managed multiple nonprofits, oftentimes funders ask a person receiving funds, an organization has 15 different funders and 15 different asks around the same population. And so, for example, one funder may say, we want you to get people out of tents in a shelter. And another funder says, we want you to get people from in a shelter to permanent housing. And somebody else says, we want you to focus on African Americans. And so it's hard for an organization to specialize or focus in anything because they have to answer to 15 different funders. And so the alignment of the folks who are paying for the services is critical. And so what Felicia's organization is doing is making sure that funders are aligned, all asking for the same thing and all rowing in the same direction. And so I would say for the first time ever in the county, we have funders rowing in the same direction, and service providers rowing in the same direction, and elected officials rowing in the same direction, which means we can solve the problem.
That's really encouraging. A lot of what you're talking about there is sort of invisible or not visible to the average person walking on a downtown sidewalk and seeing someone who's homeless or having to clean up the front of their business or their residence or something. One of the things you mentioned, I reeled off a bunch of numbers at the start of the program, and you talked about the point in time counts. One thing during the pandemic that I thought was very interesting to follow were these dashboards that had the number of tests that were administered, the positivity rate, the hospitalization rate, all these sort of things you could check every day with daily information updates and see where things were trending. Do we count homelessness enough? Do we quantify the number of tents, the number of people being served or participating or somehow left out of the system? Do we count them enough?
Mark, let me take one shot really quick, and then I'll pass the baton to you.
Okay.
I just from the difference between, I think you can't compare the pandemic to counting homeless people, and this is why. And then I'll pass it to Mark because they're the expert here. In the state of Washington, people who live unsheltered have to opt in to sharing their personal information, as they should have to opt in. It shouldn't be required. Therefore, we don't have a way to make sure in our current data set that we aren't duplicating people. So for example, Johnny can go to a shelter and choose to just say, my name is Johnny, and then go to a different shelter and say, my name is Mark. And oftentimes this happens because they don't trust the systems that are in place to protect them and their information, and they don't have to. So they don't have to share certain information in order to get services. And so for me, and my vantage point in my small stint in homelessness compared to Felicia and Mark, it has been very difficult to get a handle on numbers in the way that you just described, due to not being able to eliminate duplications in the database. So that's all I wanted to say, Mark. Your turn.
Thanks. So I think the question from my perspective is not, do we count people enough, but do we measure the right stuff? And we collect a lot of data. So if you go to the KCRHA website, which we just relaunched today, it's much easier to navigate, take a gander. There's a tab called data. You can go there. We got a lot of dashboards. They're great. And one of the things I think people don't know is that King County actually is one of the leaders in the nation in high quality data around homelessness. Like what we know with near absolute certainty. It just is the wrong information. Right? Like and that to me is the core here, right? Is that many of the questions that it makes sense to ask are not answerable by how we have structured metrics in the past, because those metrics have been focused less on what I consider to be client level data and client serving data and more on administrative data, right? So what is the raw number of people is an administrative data item. How are people actually migrating towards housing is a client-centered data item, right? So what we are going to be doing over the next year or so in partnership with some of our private sector partners actually is developing what we're calling a by name list, which is a term of art in the homelessness space, but essentially it just says like, hey, we need to know everyone who needs our help. We need to know like what their name is, where they are, what those needs are, et cetera. But what I've asked my team to do, in partnership with our private sector partners, is to take that one step further and essentially develop what I keep calling like my chart, but for homelessness, right? Because we actually need to understand, hey, you've seen, so to Tiffany's perspective, right, or Tiffany's point, like it's very easy to go from one provider to another, and not have any of those pieces of information touch, right? And not like even discounting there, because there are a lot of people who opt in. The majority of people opt in, right? So, but those data sets never actually sync up. Whereas, right, if you think about how you experience going to the physician, when you go see your primary care doctor and they say, I think you need to see a nephrologist, right? When you go to the kidney doctor, when you go to the nephrologist is like, hey, I have your information. I know why you're here, right? And that has become the norm, right? We expect that level of service in the medical system, right? That is not the norm in the homelessness system. And it, like, the back end to do it is simply not there. And so what we're trying to do through our BNL work is actually ensure that there is that symmetry of understanding about what a single person needs, so that, right, when they give data, as a result, the service actually gets better. Because right now we ask a lot of questions, but it doesn't actually make the service better, which doesn't incentivize anyone to tell us the truth unless they, feel like telling us the truth. The other thing that I would say, again, going back to like, are we measuring the right stuff, is so knowing the number, knowing what interactions people are having, et cetera, all that's good. But what I really want to know is the stuff that we're doing actually producing housing outcomes, right? And in order to understand that, what I need is not just the raw rate of exits from each portfolio type. I need more granular data, again, about what interactions are people having that are producing this outcome versus what interactions are people having that are not producing that outcome. And that is not yet trackable in the way that it needs to be. So, and there are a number of ways we might move towards measuring that. We can look at, this is not a like invent new stuff perspective. This is a question of what do we need to pull off the shelf? There are a lot of ways that we look at things like stages of change or other ways that folks can engage towards, in terms of measuring movement towards a goal. But so all this is to say that the issue is not how high quality our data is. From my perspective, the issue is, have we ever measured the right stuff? And have we ever set up the infrastructure necessary for that measurement to be 360, I should say.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Can I add something really
quick?
Go
ahead.
Marc can set up the infrastructure now faster and in a way that we've never been able to do, because the city might want to have set up the infrastructure, but the county may not have wanted to set up the infrastructure, or Auburn maybe have been willing to set up the infrastructure, but Tukwila wasn't willing to set up the infrastructure. But now Marc has everyone's data in one place and can make the decision themselves to set up the infrastructure, and does not have to ask 15 different elected officials if they can do so.
Yeah, and I would go out on a limb and say everyone participating this morning wants you guys to succeed. They want everything that you're trying to accomplish to happen, in spades. But it's almost like there's a battle of competing narratives. There's the visual narrative that's been at play for many years now in Seattle. The fact we're 7 years into the Seattle-King County state of emergency around homelessness. And just the sort of the vibe, the reputation that's come up about, the tents and the RVs and the problem as it stands that people witness just in their day-to-day lives. All the stuff that you guys are doing, it sounds like great sort of back of house, back of end infrastructure, which is super critical. But in that battle for hearts and minds, to demonstrate to people that you're making progress and that, that people can still have confidence that 6 months from now, things will be better. A year from now, they'll be better than that. How do you take all that back end stuff, which is critical, and I'm glad to hear you're doing it, but how do you take that and package it in a way that's not spin or propaganda, but again, to get to back to the COVID dashboard kind of thing, how do you give people a really clear picture of what's going on that feels transparent and feels like it is the right data for what you're trying to accomplish, but also the right data for that battle of hearts and minds? Who wants to take that? Was there a question there? I think there was a question in there.
There's a question in there. I'll give it a crack. I think everyone has a perspective on this, so I'll be brief to make space. From our perspective, we at the Authority think about, as I think most planners and strategists do, we think about our near, mid, and long-term goals, right? And think about like, what is the structure that supports each of those things? So much of what I've been talking about this morning already is really focused in our midterm goal range. And our near-term goal range, that's where some of our work around Partnership for Zero comes in, right? So we were funded in February. We'll have boots on the ground next month, focused on developing a downtown focused, for right now, by name list, and looking.
Can I pause you for a second? Can you talk a little bit more and explain what Partnership for Zero is, what the goals are, and just give us a kind of for someone who has no idea what that is, can you give us the brief version of what that is?
Yeah. So Partnership for Zero is a emergency command style approach to ending chronic unsheltered homelessness in the downtown core. The idea is to unify the work that the city, county, and authority do inside the homelessness space under one, sort of command center model, and through a peer navigation approach, drive significant reduction in the number of people who are unsheltered in the downtown core. That's the 50,000 foot. There are a lot of reasons why, some of these models have been selected, most having to do with their evidence of being successful in other jurisdictions that maintained low levels of unsheltered homelessness, right? The thing that I think is really important, though, is that part of why we entered into this partnership with the city, with WeRN, with the county, is that recognizing that much of, to your point, much of what I just described is back-end stuff, is infrastructure, is about integrating systems that have historically been quite fractured, and right, that we also need to be producing better outcomes for people in the near term in terms of months, not years. And in order to do that, that's going to require significant deployment of just sheer people power in order to drive the outcomes that we want to see, while still operating inside a level of fragmentation that is significantly suboptimal.
I would say and I've had this conversation with many folks, and then I'm happy to talk about kind of what Marc said earlier. My main job is to ensure that the right-of-ways are clear and accessible, safe, parks are open and free for everyone. But one of the things is we have not had a mayor longer than 2 terms since 1990. We will not fix this if we don't have continuity. Because as someone who worked inside of a department, every time a new mayor comes on, a new vision starts. To think that we can end homelessness, changing mayors every 4 years, is insanity. And so one of the things that I would say is, in my experience, we are a little harsh in Seattle, harsher than other places. And we have to ask ourselves, are the things that we're upset about more important than the continuity in order to solve a problem? And so what I can say beyond a reasonable doubt is that if Marc, Felicia, myself, and the current elected officials are here in 10 years, this conversation will be something in the very far past. But if we all recycle in 4 years, God help us.
So where we are you launching the the Herald 2025 campaign right now?
I am not launching it.
Is there a website?
Someone who's tried to figure out why in the world can't we solve this problem? And the answer is we've had 6 directors over the Human Services Department in 6 years, maybe. We've had no WeRN. We've had no KCRHA. We've had multiple directors over the county's human service. No corporation would be successful if they changed leadership as much as the city of Seattle and the county do.
And I want to really double down on something that Tiffany's saying right now, because I think it's actually really important that in my audit of previous strategies, almost all of them were well suited for the time in which they were developed and could have been successful. None of them were implemented, not a single one. And that is because strategy development does take some time, right? You take some time to build it. By the time people got around to this is a good strategy and went into implementation, for lack of a better term, some department got beheaded and then someone new came in and was like, I don't like that strategy, start again. And that just in looking at the patterns of strategy development and then where did implementation start and then stop, that was my takeaway. And again, right, I think it's important to note that almost any of those strategies could have worked in the time they were developed if they had been implemented. But implementation of this scale takes, to Tiffany's point, years to do. And that's not, I just want to be clear for the public, that's not running from accountability, right? Like metrics and like being clear about what the progress is through those years, like we got to do that. We have to be able to be clear that like there is success underway. And also it would be irresponsible for any of us to stand in front of you and say, this will be done in 6 months. If everyone just lets it, no, that's not where we are, right? We were there in 1982, but it's not where we are now. And so to that point, it is actually quite critical that even if the faces on this screen change, the strategy cannot. Otherwise, we will just forever cycle through what is the new plan, who is the new face explaining the plan, but there will be no action.
Let's talk about some of those specific strategies around like mental health and substance abuse, because that seems to be, that's an eternal presence in the homelessness population, and it seems to be getting worse in recent years, or certainly more visible during the pandemic. Are there strategies from the past, or what's the strategy that's in place right now, and what's the outlook for that?
All right, Mark, you can,
You came up.
It's a county state funded issue, and you have the county funds, so I'll defer to you.
So what I can say is that like there are a couple things that we should delineate, right? One is that not everyone who experiences significant mental health crisis experiences homelessness. And in fact, when we look at people's progression, what we often find is that the experience of homelessness triggers mental health issues, not the other way around. The other thing that we should be really clear about is that the deficit of what we call residential treatment beds, or like beds for people who are in significant mental health crisis in this county, is extremely severe. I believe, and this is a question that Director Flora, the Department of Community and Human Services of the county, has at his fingertips more adeptly than I do, but I believe there are only about 200 residential treatment beds in the county, right? By contrast, right, a simple prevalence analysis tells me that there are probably between 7,000 and 9,000 people in the population experiencing homelessness, right, who need at some point over the course of a year access to a residential treatment bed. If I take the county at large, right, all roughly 3 million people, that number goes way up, right? So like where we are in terms of our ability to respond to anyone's substance use needs, anyone's mental health needs, is way behind the 8 ball, right? So the crisis that we see outside, I think oftentimes, it's very visible to us, but we should not forget that there are lots and lots of people struggling in homes, in apartments right now while we have this conversation, who also need access to those resources and aren't getting it. So there is a wholesale, like, what is happening here that needs to be done in order for us to right size the mental health system. And I know that Director Flora works on that every day. And I'm in conversation with him about it quite consistently. What I will say, specific to people experiencing homelessness, and is, was in my budget last year, is in my budget proposal for this year, is that we need to develop what we're calling high acuity supports for people experiencing homelessness, right? So that is, we need shelters that have the density of service necessary with medication management, psych RNs, regular RNs, right? Who can provide the care necessary for folks who are coming out of significant crisis, allow them to stabilize, and then transition to the appropriate system of care for their long-term support, right? Currently, one of the big issues is that, and this is part of, again, what Deputy Mayor Washington was saying about the what I'm able to see because of the organizational structure. What I can see very clearly is that none of the sites that we currently operate have the service density necessary to meet those needs. That's not the person's fault. That's not the provider's fault. It is just a mismatch. And so people show up, they are in crisis, and the shelter doesn't have the kinds of supports necessary to support them in that crisis. And so they're back out pretty quickly, right? We need to make sure that like everyone who is experiencing unsheltered homelessness has the right front door, as I call it with my team, into the right system of care. And right now, many of those front doors don't adequately exist.
Yeah. And private sector, businesses, individuals, funders outside the government sector, obviously there's no shortage of places where they can help, where people do want to help, as short-tempered as people have become, or as limited as people's patience has become, 7 years into the state of emergency. There's a new way that individuals and private organizations can take part in being part of the solution. And Felicia, that's where we are in. What are you guys doing to sort of channel that desire for people, whether they're an individual or a business or a philanthropy, who want to help, to channel it in a way that's going to contribute to this more comprehensive solution?
Yeah, great question. I think that there is just a lack of information about what's really happening. And so back to your earlier question about communications and how people really understand what the system is providing, we have not done a great job of explaining what we do every day, right? And where people should be pointing to think about why they're continuing to see tents increase on the streets, right? And so for the work that we're doing, that Marc's leading at the KCRHA, they have dramatically increased the amount of permanent exits that happen for households experiencing homelessness in the community each year. So while that may not be visible, again, because of the growing number of tents and encampments in our communities, we actually have increased system capacity over time. And so it's really important for us to explain that to people, that we've made system improvements through additional resources, but also through right-sizing some of our existing resources as well, but really painting the picture of why we continue to see those growing numbers of folks experiencing homelessness. So as Marc said earlier on, they have purview over the crisis response, which means someone must become homeless first before we can actually assist them with the existing resources in our community. And unfortunately, that makes it a much more expensive encounter with that person. And that person then has to experience the trauma of being homeless in the first place. And so we really want people to understand some of the upstream causes of why we see this issue continue to grow. That inflow issue is really what's also keeping us in this constant cycle of readdressing our strategies and trying to implement new ideas, but really we're not making the dent that we want to see in our community because that inflow number continues to grow over time as well. So even as we talk about behavioral health, mental health services, substance use disorder services, if we're not able to provide someone with housing, but we're able to provide them with all those services, they continue to be homeless in our community. And those services have less efficacy as well because they do not have a stable place to lay their head at night. And so that's also important for people to understand. That is part of their healthcare. They need to have mental health services and other services tailored to their specific needs. But if we do not provide them with housing, or if it's shelter in the short term, then they continue to languish outside and they can become more severe situations for those people, more unsafe for them and also for our broader community as well. And so that's really the picture we want to paint. We want people to have a better understanding of what's contributing to the issue of homelessness and then what those solutions are, because we need to take them to scale. And that's really the issue we have, is how do we scale things that we know work well in our community so that we can help more people.
And you guys are channeling, you're actively seeking private support, right, for things. Are you guys involved in the, tell me how that works. If someone wants to take part and they don't know how to get involved, how does We Are In work for identifying funders and soliciting those kinds of donations or other support?
Yeah, great question. So we are membership based, so anyone can become a part of We Are In who's on the private philanthropy or business side, who wants to make contributions, or who's really just interested in this issue and wants to learn ways that they can support through advocacy or communications or other means as well. So we're always interested in just having a conversation to see where businesses or philanthropy may be at, and giving them a little bit of background on We Are In, but also KCRHA and what's already working around this issue. So I'm happy to meet with folks that would like to become part of the We Are In coalition. Specific to what happened for Partnership for Zero, for example, so that was our first kind of fundraising effort to support the crisis response system, really pilot a new initiative that we have just so much belief in and are really excited about. We worked with our partner Challenge Seattle, who is also has a lot of business partners that are in their membership as well. They, through a polling opportunity, recognized from their membership that homelessness was the #1 issue. And so they were able to connect directly with We Are In to think about what types of supports they could provide to really catalyze some solutions around this issue specifically. And so we work with business groups, not just individual organizations who want to become part of the solution and part of our coalition as well.
Okay. One of the things we often talk about silver linings on these programs, because I like silver linings. I know the pandemic shifted the way that we think about housing people and finding people, finding ways to get people off the streets, including buying hotels, leasing hotels, think there's a new shelter coming online in Soto related to mental health and substance abuse. Who wants to give me an update on kind of what's the latest in how we're actually finding beds and places where people can live rather than on the streets? Because that seems like the sort of the core of the issue comes down to finding some place where someone can actually call home.
Let me say this, and then I'll pass it to Marc. Marc has a fabulous analogy of an emergency room. If adding more beds was the solution, we would have fixed it by now. That simple. And so adding more beds is not the solution in and of itself. System effectiveness is the answer. Because emergency shelter should be just that, emergency shelter, where you triage people and you get them to the place they need to be. It should not be a place where people sit for 300 days. And so while I am an advocate of adding more beds, and while Mayor Harold has committed to identifying more beds, I don't want people to have the illusion that adding beds is going to solve the problem. Because if that were the answer, it would be solved by now. Across the country, it'd be solved, but it's not.
Yeah.
Marc?
No, that's exactly it, right? Is that like I've had the privilege of working all over the nation. I have watched many communities pursue a shelter bed strategy at the expense of almost everything else. And they have billion with a B, shelter systems, and people are still experiencing homelessness. They still have massive inflow. The reason is that it is, I mean, to Tiffany's point, the metaphor I use is it is just a continued expansion of the emergency department, but you've done nothing to scale the hospital itself, right? And so you wind up with a massive ED, but no one's going anywhere, right? No one's actually getting care, no one's getting treatment, no one's getting discharged. And so every time we hyper focus on just more shelter beds, just more shelter beds, just more shelter beds, we miss the opportunity to think about what is the long-term or even midterm, frankly, right? Opportunity to create a more stable system that has real throughput, where people are not going to live in shelter, but it is, the goal for shelter should be, the system-wide goal is currently 90 days or less. We never hit that, just to be clear. But it should actually be like 30 days or less. You shouldn't be in a shelter for really any period of time before you have access to some form of housing resource. And so if we don't rethink even how we approach sheltering so that it becomes broadly, I mean, and you'll see this in our budget proposals from the authority, we have proposed emergency housing, right? Like we're saying everything should be more like housing and less like shelter so that we can generate stability and help people track to what is your permanent thing. But that's the kind of broad system transformation that is necessary. And when I say that, what I also want to be clear is like, that doesn't require us, to do this over 500 years, right? Like we have an opportunity to think through, as the pandemic showed us, frankly, acquisition strategies, onlining things that are essentially ready to go and converting them into what our system needs. And that is something that I'm delighted, frankly, to work with Deputy Mayor Washington on, again, like every day, like thinking through what is out there, what can we get access to, how fast can we get it, right? And how is it gonna be more like housing and less like our previous shelter models?
And just so you know, we are clear that we have to work in the spirit of both and. We can't say, have patience with us for another 7 years while we try to address this emergency, let all the tents stay where they are, and we'll get back to you when we build this perfect system. So we are working in the spirit of both and very aware of the frustration that people feel having had patients for so long. But I just think that at some point there needs to be collective accountability on how we as a society have allowed ourselves to get to this place. The hyper focus on shelter and the people that you can see completely ignoring that you can stop throwing babies in the water if you just go upstream and think about the kid that needs to enroll in a high quality preschool You can't fix the emergency and not fix the thing that is causing people to be homeless. You will just continue to perpetuate homeless people. And so my goal today is not to ignore the fact that there's an emergency, and I personally have a responsibility to address it now, but not let us all off the hook of the fact that people aren't making a livable wage. As the comment just said, people, DESC, our providers can't hire people because they can't make a livable wage. That kids need quality preschool. Like, there are so many upstream things that we could be doing at the same time we're dealing with the emergency. But if we just deal with what makes us the most uncomfortable at this time and not think about the second grader, that also won't help us solve the problem.
I want to ask a question about other metropolitan areas that might be doing a better job in certain areas, or that might be worth looking at for the Seattle King County area. But there's been a couple questions in the chat box about sort of tiny houses and, you know, individual sort of non-congregate housing versus the notion of a shelter. I know that in the pandemic, you know, King County purchased a number of motels. I think Seattle leased some space for temporary housing, but can we give maybe like a field guide to the current options for housing people beyond the shelter space, about kind of how the tiny house idea fits into the hotels and motels that King County purchased? Can you give us a little bit of a primer on that stuff?
Sure. Haven't heard the word primer in a while.
You've come to the right place.
So the 13 hotels that King County purchased are part of what's called their Health Through Housing program. No one on this screen oversees any of that. You need to direct all questions about that to Director Leo Floor. He is very informative. He has a great presentation on it. You should, I saw it earlier this week, actually, at a different event. Essentially, those 13 hotels are onlining now. They are becoming permanent supportive housing. So like, they will become housing options for people as they turn on. We, the authority, again, play a limited role there, primarily in working to place people in those permanent supportive housing options. That falls under our purview. Beyond that, what we really have, and this is where it's important for us to understand the evolution of the shelter system, where it's been, where it needs to go, right? So before the pandemic, we largely operated congregate shelter systems. Some of them, Seattle drove actually a lot of their sheltering system to become what's called enhanced, meaning there were services, but much of shelter, the history of shelter in this country is that it was just a place to sleep. You went in at 6, 7, you left by 5 or 6 in the morning, and there was not a lot else happening, right? And even some of the enhanced shelter systems still, they weren't 24/7, although that was starting to change before the pandemic. But in a congregate setting, I want to be really clear, you are sleeping 6 inches from someone else. Like that, like you are like right here to another person, right? We are talking like 300 people in a room at one of the largest congregate settings that was in downtown, like packed in bunk beds at that distance from each other. So when we talk about like people refusing to go to shelter, those were the kinds of spaces they were declining, right? And saying, this does not feel safe to me. This does not feel, it's not helping me. What we saw over the pandemic is because it was not safe, right? That became unsafe because of COVID. We saw a movement across the country towards non-congregate space, meaning you have some kind of door, right? For our community in particular, before the pandemic, the only non-congregate option was what people refer to as tiny homes, right? Which are these small, about 96 square foot structures. They have electricity, a simple bed, but that's really it. They door to close, right? But like I think the word home sometimes, because we often see tiny homes on Instagram and that kind of stuff, right? We think that's where we're headed. These are not that. These are very simple structures. That said, they were highly desirable because they were the only non-congregate option. So if you were a couple, if you had a pet, if you just wanted a door, that was your option, right? And so that's why we see people saying like, that's what I want, that's what I want, that's what I want, that's what I want. Since the pandemic, we have really begun to drive towards non-congregate as the model, right? Looking at a number of different ways to make that happen inside a number of different space types. And so we're seeing higher rates of receptiveness to placement in shelter because that shelter is more dignity-based, right? So that's really where we're driving. The authority has funded this year about 300 new shelter beds. They're all non-congregate already. We will continue to work with our partners at city and county to stand up more beds. They will be non-congregate or in that emergency housing space. And what we're seeing is that people are much more like engaged, like, yes, that makes sense to me. I can do that, right? Because we are offering them something that is, again, like is about human dignity. I think that the what I want to lift up, right, is that across the country, where we have seen high performing shelter systems, they are designed that way, right? They are designed in such a way that like people are like, hey, I can make that work, right? Like this isn't scary for me. I feel safe, right? When we see low performing shelter systems, it's because they are scary to be inside of. And so this shift that we're making right now is really helping us to drive placement to assist people in exiting unsheltered positions.
And I would caution a hyper focus on tiny home villages.
Yes.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize.
They are not, sorry, Felicia. Look,
oh, no, I think we're on the same page, Tiffany. I just wanted to emphasize, in case it wasn't clear from what Marc shared, that tiny houses, congregate shelter, enhanced shelter, all of those are shelter. So for folks that are living inside of those temporarily, because they're all temporary, they are still considered homeless.
Correct.
So until you reach permanent housing, until you are connected to permanent housing, you are still homeless. So tiny houses, even though houses is in the name, are actually shelters, tiny shelters.
And if you could imagine what the city would look like if we built 200 tiny home villages across the city in 5 years, what it would look like. People would not, the general public would not be pleased. And so while I appreciate tiny home villages and we fund tiny home villages, there is this hyper focus on tiny home villages right now that I just would love to taper to a reasonable expectation, because we're not going to fill the city with tiny home villages.
I think that's one of those visual communications things. I think Marc touched on it, where it's like, look at this cute little tiny home. I mean, it's sort of this, in this competing narrative which is so complex, and we've just barely scraped the surface this morning. So much of the decisions people make or the judgments people make are based on what they see, and they don't see the back of house stuff or the systems that you guys are working to implement and to smooth out the wrinkles in. They don't see the complexity. They just see the tent or the tiny house or the picture of the tiny house village. I mean, it's I don't envy the communications battle that I think you guys have. I think you do. You have almost like to wage a communications war. Because as I said earlier, everybody wants you to succeed. Everybody wants to feel good that the money that's being spent is making us achieve progress. And I think even people in Seattle are patient enough if you explain to them that it's not going to take 6 months, it's going to take more than that. In spite of the 7 years of the emergency situation, I know I still feel personally patient enough to wait as the solution comes into play as we see progress. Almost out of time here. A couple quick questions. Are there other cities, particularly on the West Coast, Portland, San Francisco, or Los Angeles, who are doing things that we should be doing here in Seattle, King County, or are doing what we're doing here, but doing it better?
I don't think so. Marc?
No, I get this. I used to get this question. So when I was a national consultant, I got this question in every city I was in. They're like, who's fixed this thing? And like, the answer is no one, right? Like, when we look at large metropolitan cities, not a single one has ever hit functional zero. I have faith we will be the first, but like we're gonna have to innovate in order to make that happen. When we look up and down the West Coast, in particular, we see all of the West Coast struggles with folks who have been priced out of housing and now live in vehicles, and we don't have good pathways back into housing for them. Again, if I look across the country, I see, there are some communities that have fewer, visible structures, maybe in their downtown areas, et cetera. They often do that through pretty significant enforcement mechanisms, and then also having, as in New York, where they have a right to shelter, they don't have a right to housing. So as a result, they have, I'm not kidding, a multi-billion-dollar shelter system. I think, as if I'm remembering correctly, the last time I looked at it, it was north of like $4 billion just on shelter. So, which is, we can't do that, just so we're clear. We don't have that kind of money, and it's not a good investment. The other thing that I would say is that some of the COVID related innovations have been more about building, non-congregate space, dignity-based space. We've seen some really significant advancement there. Salt Lake is doing something really interesting with some intentional community and some non-congregate spaces. I also want to give a shout out to a colleague of mine who I've known for many years. She's the former commissioner of public health in Massachusetts, now running homelessness there, Monica Burrell, who helped to resolve through a really, really intentional person-based strategy, roughly 150 person encampment that had developed there, where they went in, and we've begun to pilot similar approaches here. But they went in, they did a full census of all 150 people, found out like, what do you need, developed a by name list, et cetera. What made what they did different is they actually then launched new programming in response to what those folks said that they needed, right? So where they identified a complete void, like, hey, 40 people have asked for this and we just don't have it, right? They then said, okay, if we're going to resolve this encampment, then our job is to immediately launch that thing that people are asking for. And so I'd like us to be able to get closer to that kind of like very fast call and response of like, this is what people are asking for, this is what we're going to do, right? So that, I think, is sort of my take on the national landscape and sort of where we are in terms of pre-COVID innovation, which was not great, and post-COVID innovation, which I'm hopeful around.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I want to give each of you like 15 seconds to tell me one positive thing that people on the streets of downtown Seattle will see in the next 6 months. They can look at and point to and say, "Hey, it's getting better." And I don't mean that in a glib way. Give me kind of a really quick something to look forward to, something positive that we're going to see the visual evidence of in the coming months. Do you want to start, Felicia?
Sure, happy to start. I think, as Marc mentioned, we're really excited to see boots on the ground next month with our Partnership for Zero investment. And so I think folks, especially in the downtown core, will be able to see outreach workers really engaging with people who are living unsheltered to identify their unique needs and to connect them with the appropriate services. And so we hope to have staff on the ground who've been through similar experience to really help navigate for people who are living unsheltered right now, so that we can drive down those unsheltered numbers in one specific geographic location. So Excellent. Really looking forward to that.
Excellent. How about you, Deputy Mayor Washington?
I would hope people have already seen differences in downtown, or I've been working for nothing for 5 months. So I hope folks see a continuation of what they've already seen, which is having people who are living in tents, specifically those who are in the right of way in public parks, receiving offers of shelter to come inside, and public space is restored. So you will continue to see more of that.
Okay, Marc, 15 seconds.
I'm excited for you to see our KCRHA system advocates on the ground next month, working with people, building out their caseloads, beginning to support people's transitions. I'm also really excited to open some of the shelters that we funded over the next couple months, and for some work in the pipeline with our colleagues at City of Seattle that I think will also result in additional capacity for the system, and we will be able to stand there and point at it.
All right. I want to thank our panelists, Marc Dones, Felicia Salcedo, Deputy Mayor Tiffany Washington, and thank you all for joining us for this DSA program. I want to thank the fabulous DSA staff, Emily Baylor and James Cito. And I want to invite you to join us next month for the DSA Metropolitan Improvement District annual meeting. That event will take place on Wednesday, June 29th. It's a great opportunity to connect with your fellow DSA supporters. Registration is open this week at downtownseattle.org. I hope we can all get together and talk about this issue again in the future. I hope we can talk about it constantly. I think communication, as I mentioned earlier, it's a war. It's a happy war to win the hearts and minds of people to keep supporting the work you guys are doing. Until we meet again, I'm Feliks Banel on behalf of DSA. Thanks for joining us this morning, and we will see you downtown.